What is up, theology nerds? This is Trip, and today on Homebrewed Christianity, we are joined by a living legend, one of the greatest theological ethicists the church has ever produced, a brilliant scholar, a lifelong activist and organizer, and the Reinhold Niebuhr Chair at Union Theological Seminary in New York, Gary Dorrien. That's right, Gary Dorrien's on the podcast. This is the first time he's been on, and guess what? It's a doozy. It's amazing. We cover a host of different topics because it's really hard to narrow things down when you're talking to the machine. And I mean that in a complimentary way, not like a negation of his humanity, but a kind of an awestruck wonder that comes about by someone who's able to produce so many amazing works and keep in his head like the history of social ethics, the history of the liberal theological tradition, to articulate the social gospel movement, to bring together scholarship of the black social gospel movement and articulate it in ways the academy is just trying to catch up and put together. He's been a pioneer at weaving together ethics, social theory, philosophy, theology, politics, intellectual history, all in ways that both recognize the possibility, the vibrance, the history of liberal Protestantism, and that demand for it to be open and transformed by our current context. And I think you're going to hear that. It was quite a treat that he had just finished his autobiography, a theological memoir of sorts. And so he's in the mood to tell some personal stories, which I don't know about you, but it got me pumped for this memoir. And then he goes in and describes what is the nature of the liberal theological tradition. What are the connections between theology and politics? Who is it that animated him? How did he find a place in the Anglican tradition? This is a fun conversation. There's like a whole aside about Bonhoeffer and Niebuhr's relationship in New York. And all that to say, he's coming to Theology Beer Camp. That's right. Gary Dorrien is going to be at Theology Beer Camp. So if you're wise, if you like hanging out with a whole bunch of nerds, maybe like 30 plus scholars, and you dig podcasts, I mean, you're listening to one right now, and there's going to be like 30 God pods there, throw that on top of the opportunity to taste the wonderful craft beverage collection of Colorado, have meals with friends and such, like over 500 other people who dig nerdy podcasts, visions of the faith that are open, inclusive, and committed to justice and such. And then on top of that, we're going to have some like music. We're going to have some fun. So come on, theologybeer.camp is the URL. October 17th and 19th in Denver, Colorado. Get up, get on. And we got like a hotel room, all things kind of set up. So you should check that out because you know what? Beer camp is cool. One of the things at Theology Beer Camp is there's lots of craft beverages. Well, they're more enjoyable if you have a room at the conference hotel with a shuttle. You know what I mean? Safety is a great policy. All right, here we go. Gary Dorrien on the podcast for the first time, but not the last time. Enjoy, friends. I'm interested as a scholar, like a lot of theologians that contribute to kind of the contemporary constructive conversation end up being grounded, say, in kind of multi-religious conversations, or end up grounded in science and religion discourse and thinking metaphysically. And you contribute both constructive things in theology and thinking about ethics, but always have a major dialogue piece with attentive history to the tradition, the figures, the movements, and how it's tangled up in what's going on. I'd love to hear the origin story of how that became your vocation as a scholar that like is attending to the historical story and the biographies and such, and kind of the history of the ideas and the history of kind of the ethical challenges and reformations of state economy and such.
Well, there are three concrete things I can think of that speak to that. But certainly the first one is that I grew up only nominally Roman Catholic. So that Roman Catholic background did have an imprint on me. I have a Catholic soul. It's just the impact of Jesus on a cross overhanging the altar speaks to me, breaks through my lower class trailer park road life like nothing else. So it was my first story, even kind of sense of something beyond this everyday world that I am somewhat alienated from. That speaks to who I was, but also what I'm going to have to overcome in order to belong to anything. And I didn't join a church until I was 29 years old, so it's not. I had to think about this a long time before I finally found a church that I actually joined. But there's firstly that outsider with a certain yearning and certainly a spiritual, intellectual sensibility that doesn't have a home, but is looking to acquire one, including a worldview that would go with it. So I've always been that person. In fact, when I started the memoir, I tell some stories about being 9 years old and negotiating these very things. So that's firstly that kind of search to find a place myself somewhere. And so I have that story is occurring several times for me in different contexts, where if I enter some kind of space, enter some kind of maybe a liberal Protestant tradition, later on it's a democratic socialist tradition, whatever it is that I'm sort of entering, I do have this kind of second nature to me to say, I can't even place myself here unless I've learned the story of this group. What kind of outfit is this? And so that is second nature to me, to just have to become a kind of historian of whatever it is, whatever group identity I might be trying out. Goodness, I went through the same thing with the Jesuits for a while. For a while, that was maybe a possibility in my nominally Catholic, but with a Catholic soul youth, where I thought that's at least a possibility. So that is a recurring dynamic for me, just that coming from quite impoverished background and yet trying to read myself into groups, stories, traditions that I've got to learn about. And then when I got to Alma College, it's sophomore year, no, second term, my freshman year, getting my first dose of Immanuel Kant, and they're trying to make Kant, easy there at Alma. So it's just bits from the foundations of the metaphysics of morals and the second critique, where it's the moral religion Kant that we're getting. And I am taken already. The idea that this guy's the greatest philosopher of the modern experience is made an impression on me right away. My teacher certainly treated him that way, but I learned something about myself in that context of being struck by Immanuel Kant and wanting to learn all that I could about it, and even just understanding what we were doing in that course on value in modern philosophy, since that was said to be the modern philosophical problematic, is how do you find value in a world of facts? And I just couldn't start there. I thought, well, wait a minute. We're starting in midstream, aren't we? I mean, he wrote this colossal book before this. And that's what his towering reputation is based on. And so if Kant is as important as they say, well, my God, I can't start here. I have to back up and work my way through this colossal text that, of course, they don't teach at Alma College, because why would you throw that thing at 19-year-olds? But I spent, that whole next summer just working my way through the first critique. Boy, that was a difficult struggle, partly because Kant's just a horrible writer. But of course, the ideas themselves are just so forbiddingly abstract, and it's hard to see how one links to another. And yet I am just so utterly determined. I will just stick with this book. It doesn't matter that most of the pages are incomprehensible. I cheer every time something is comprehensible. And if I just spend enough time with this book, enough of it will seep in that I'll begin to get some kind of handle on it.
Oh,
and then
that feeling.
Can't eat anything, and the surgery had gone very, very badly, so I was really in misery. But I read John Patrick Dickens' book Up from Communism, and that I was just enthralled by this book. That is a distinctive kind of intellectual combination, intellectual and political history, and just realizing I love it. There's some kind of genre here that I've never seen quite anywhere else. And on top of it, I had tracked that neocon phenomenon from Alma College onward. I watched it as it developed, reading the next issue of Commentary magazine every month. I would await it with just fascinated dread and appalled and intrigued in some way. These people all used to be lefties, and yet now they're all writing these scathing polemics against feminists and Black Power and just everybody on the left. So there's that conversion story, and the fact that a lot of them are still saying that they're lefties, and yet they've so clearly left it behind. I had tracked that from college. It's one of my intellectual obsessions from college onward, but this neoconservative phenomenon. And now I'm reading Diggins, and he's describing something a generation before where I can see, oh my goodness, it's that neocon story, except a generation ago. In these figures, James Burnham and Jontos Pesos and Max Eastman and who was the other? Will Herberg was the fourth one in that book. There was a kind of fascination about the connection of something I'm just learning about now, about a prior generation of former lefties who, when they left the left, they didn't stop it. They didn't stop for a moment at liberalism. They always hated liberalism. Now they've got to go all the way to the far right, which in that time, of course, was National Review magazine. That book, and later, many years later, I got to know Jack Diggins himself. That explains a fair amount about just how I ended up, what sort of a disciplinary niche I ended up in, what kind of book I'm writing, because I write the kind of books that I love to read. And they have that. These are three stories about something quite similar.
That's really interesting. Like even those vignettes, and having got to interview a bunch of scholars, a lot of them have that moment in undergrad where you had no idea what you were reading, but you were going to finish it, and you came up for air on these random quotes, and you're like, okay, I got this, but I know this is important. So I remember getting told I was a process theologian and it's not Christian, and I'd never read any of it, and then I spend the weekend trying to understand process and reality, which is it's its own experience. And then you get to part 5, and you're like, all right, yeah, I don't know anything about the math stuff he was talking about earlier, but that Justinian's authors edited this junk. Yeah, I get it. And when you mentioned the div school experience and the wisdom teeth, I had a hardcore case of poison ivy, and the medicine for it wouldn't let me sleep. And so I had 3 or 4 days with hardly any sleep. In order to get tired, I sat on the treadmill for 4 or 5 hours reading while walking, and I read everything by Walter Rauschenbusch in a 1 week period, and turned in my church history seminar paper with footnotes to everything from curriculums he wrote or whatever. And after I got done with that, I just it was the movement of meeting Whitehead for the first time and going, I want to go figure this out, and reading everything by Rauschenbusch. I was like, yep, now I know why I'm a Baptist. It's to tell that story and then hearing other scholars tell it, we all kind of light up with, what was that foundational text you're going to keep going back to and have to make sense? What was that figure or that type of writing that captured you? And I find it fascinating.
Yeah, that is a trope. That happened to Horace Bushnell, the great American theologian of the 19th century. It's Coleridge. He's drawn to this book. There's something in it, and yet he can't comprehend it at all until finally he goes back to it and says, now I see.
Before you gave those 3 kind of stories, you talked about this drive to learn the story of the group as a means of coming to participate in it. And I wonder if, in some sense, that is a task for a modern subject, a modern self. When we think of so many of the figures we read in church history, the multiplicity of stories that are alien to you, that are also live options, that to come to own them, you have to read and understand or participate in such, that really wasn't the case for so many thinkers prior to modernity. And so I'd love to hear how, as a theologian and a historian and such, that kind of, mixture of story as an existential task and story among other stories is a historical one. Like, describe that kind of modern moment that occasions that kind of question.
Well, I've often thought, if had I grown up in liberal Protestantism, would I have written anywhere near this many thousands of pages about it? I doubt it. I doubt very much that I would have been even, it just would have caught me, that I would have been curious enough about it, um, to have found my way into some part of it, to have had a ministry that then speaks to all these, back then kind of mainline liberal Protestant churches. And certainly that was the case in writing the Liberalism trilogy. Had it been something I'd grown up with, where it's just sort of my group, and it's, you're kind of inoculated against being too interested in it because you're not, it's just what you grew up with. I had a beloved partner for 20 years, who was a Presbyterian pastor, and grew up Lutheran. And of course, J.S. Bach that's just every Sunday for her. So when we reached a phase of our life together, when Brenda was suffering and then dying of cancer, and I discovered that J.S. Bach just spoke to me in a way that just got me through day after day. That just I just had to. I'm not sure I would have gotten through that period. And yet, on our way to chemotherapy, occasionally she'd put up with, a motet or cantata or something from Bach. And Brenda appreciated what Bach meant to me during that period, realized that I'm only getting through this because of J.S. Bach. And yet, of course, she had grown up on this. And that is just not the music that spoke to her at all. For her, it's the St. Louis Jesuits. It's Here I Am, Lord. It's it's all that. It's that songbook of the St. Louis Jesuits. The people in a tradition totally unlike hers, writing these beautiful, accessible songs, hymns that kind of speak to their spirit, that are what? In that case, that context, though those St. Louis Jesuits, they developed a music that is now commensurate with speaking to the reforms of the Second Vatican Council, that we just can't sing the Mass the way we used to now that Vatican II has occurred. So, I saw it reflexively, both, having married someone who grew up in liberal Protestantism, and it was just second nature. The habits of mind and heart, the mannerisms. She was familiar with that life world in a way that I'm still just trying to find my way into. And my early marriage was all just kind of watching her, see how she did it. And so, yes, I took it on with a vengeance and learned all that I could about this whole story, and wrote too many books about it. And now with someone who's a little bit bemused by all that I need to learn about something that she grew up with, and is just only kind of mildly interested in. And then when we got to the end of our journey together, we're like doing a switcheroo as to what is just even sustaining us spiritual in the last weeks that we even had together.
Well, your love of William Temple is how I discovered him. You gave a beautiful lecture at the beginning of lockdown on William Temple at the University of Edinburgh's online event I put together. And because I was in Scotland, I found a bunch of William Temple books at a used bookstore. And my 16-year-old now, so he was 13, I guess then, 12 or 13, I would read out loud sermons through the Confessions, Confession of Faith, at night, because we read Lord of the Rings, The Republic, Letters and Papers, and William Temple. This is the father-son reading, since he didn't get enough homework and he had me as a father. But the reason I went and found it is that it's for. I mean, I grew up a Baptist preacher's kid in the South, but the ones that have Rauschenbusch and MLK Jr. on the wall, and that's its own kind of being Baptist. Like, and deep down, Clarence Jordan is our most dear kin, and like discovering we were going to a Scottish Episcopal church there, the Anglican tradition, and participating because we're now at a place neither my wife nor I, who are both ordained Baptist clergy, are working anywhere. It's like getting to know this tradition, and then you give this beautiful lecture on using William Temple to think about the crises we're facing in the present and what the liberal Christian theological tradition can bring. And I'm just like, oh, Gary sounds like he loves him like I do Clarence Jordan, where if you ask me, Tripp, you're still a Baptist? Are Baptists allowed to like teach seminars on Whitehead? Are you sure? And I'm like, yes, there's one other. So like, when you say that, I'd love for you to take some time to kind of introduce us to William Temple. Like, how did he become not just like someone you admire or connected to, but he gave you your own permission to discover your faith, where this deep love of movement and organizational politics connects with historic institutions and liturgy and that kind of thing. Like, if people don't know William Temple, give them the lure to go find themselves something, and maybe they talk their kid into listening to it, at bedtime.
Well, of course, the lure for me was his Gifford lectures of 1932, 33, 34. And it's called Nature, Man, and God. Magnificent text that brings forth all the Logos theology and Hegel that were in him from divinity school onward. That is his own background and conflation. But then, in the context of the early 1930s, he's one of the first people who's kind of read Whitehead and can see the difference that Whitehead can make, where he's not just reading out, not just extending, not just applying a kind of Hegelian dialectic to a traditional kind of Logos theology. He can see that Whitehead actually is describing that Heraclitean world of becoming in a way that is more consonant with 20th century natural science, certainly the theoretical physics. And it's not just an argument about beginning with the mind and being concerned with that sort of Cartesian problem of how the mind into its objects of sense data and finds itself in a world and can claim to know anything, which is what he had before. So that's his own, he's on his feet giving these Gifford lectures. Logos theology and Hegel are just so deep in him that he doesn't need a text. He doesn't need note cards. He doesn't have time to even have notes because, he's a bishop on a sprawling diocese. He doesn't have time to even write this out. This is all on his feet. But recently he just read Whitehead. And so it's going on. He has the kind of mind to even be able to synthesize the two greatest sort of metaphysical systems of the whole modern experience, Hegel and Whitehead. And here's someone who can actually do it, and yet grounded. He's coming from, you just can't be more grounded than William Temple, because he has come from somewhere. His father was the Archbishop of Canterbury. In fact, his father is the quintessentially important figure in liberal theology finally being legitimized, getting a beachhead and having a standing whereby someone so clearly representing the broad church liberal wing of the Church of England, that not coming from Anglo-Catholicism, not coming from evangelicalism, but not a muddler either, coming from one of what becomes the third party in the Church of England, the broad church liberals. Frederick Temple was the first one representing that camp who actually got all the way to bishop, and he became Archbishop of Canterbury. That's where William Temple came from. He grew up in castles, and his father is the head of the whole thing, and he's not alien. He said it his whole life. All he wanted was to be like his father. So he's not someone who fights things off or has to kind of find himself somewhere. Instead, his predisposition is to go for all the truth that's in something and try to correct its flaws. So he's not someone who cuts away and now is thrust somewhere in some new space. And so I can see the difference between that sensibility and my own. I have a certain yearning, a certain, recognize that he has something that I will never have. And so there is something attractive in how he loves this Anglican tradition and the why of it. The fact that it's just philosophical all the way down, always has been. And so when he went to Oxford, Christian socialism was just really becoming something in the Church of England. And so he becomes a Christian socialist in much the same way that he became a Christian Hegelian. It was the way that you made sense of the faith in that time. It's moving. It's a social justice orientation. It's the cooperative idea. It's the idea that cooperation is the moral law of the universe. And of course, that Temple already believed that before he had socialist language for believing in it. But then he sort of took that on. So he was a democratic socialist for the rest of his career. And now, not just democratic socialist, but with he's actually, even though he can seem like a Fabian, because he's not someone, we may need the state for as much of this as is required. That's the Fabian move, to say that maybe we'll need the state to help make cooperatives work, or to get cooperatives pulled together in ways that are interactive and that build networks of solidarity. But he's basically a guild socialist. That is to say, he believes that the real action is within these worker syndicates or cooperatives at the local level. That the real action is at the local level, because that's where the most democratic self-determination is, and we need to kind of transform this whole industrial society in a way that emphasizes and rewards cooperation, not competitive, elbowing at each other, and not that kind of predatory ethos of capitalism. So Temple that's who he is his whole career. And he ends up becoming Archbishop of Canterbury himself, with intellectual commitments. On one side, the kind of Hegelian logos theology, where we're out of that kind of static world of being, where everything is in motion, everything is in process of becoming. Being itself is just kind of an abstraction from becoming in the Hegelian line, and it's also democratic socialist, where Temple would say, I'm not for charity. Give me justice, not charity, and is always involved in movements that are asking that question: what does it mean to expand, to push the ends of justice in this context, in this place? So those are the two things that just kind of shine forth in this book. That when I was at Union Theological Seminary in 1977, and I'm reading it, and I'm only there because we've lost my brother, and I had to leave Harvard Divinity School because I had good friends there. But now I've gone through something that's just shattering, where I need to be someplace where nobody knows what I'm going through, and I can just in a kind of quiet, solitary way, just survive this shattering experience. So that's what brought me to Union at the time. And now just reading this book, just a book on a shelf. It's not coming from anywhere. It's not like I read anybody or I took a course anywhere where anybody mentioned William Temple. And yet reading that book, it radiated to me everything that's already kind of in me as to how Christianity can make sense in a way that hasn't before. And so William Temple ends up being that kind of next figure of that sort in my life that ends up getting me somewhere. Now, as you know, to have even gone the way we did, since we didn't really quite, we've kind of skipped around here. You are aware that, of course, long before William Temple entered my life, Martin Luther King Jr. was the figure in my high school youth growing up. That's the first theologian I read. That's the first person who just crashed through my lower class world and took me somewhere. And then later on in college, Walter Rauschenbusch is a similar kind of galvanizing figure to me, where in both cases, with King and with Rauschenbusch, you have just the specter, the exemplar that they're that Christianity could be liberationist. Christianity should be liberationist, right? The gospel itself is justice oriented and liberating. And so for me, the existential question is, I love Martin Luther King and Rauschenbusch. How come the church doesn't sound like this? Right? This isn't what church religion sounds like ever. Well, why? That was my question for through those whole years. But as to what caught me, yes, it's King and Rauschenbusch, and then of course I played a role. Because of a suggestion I made to a college president where I was. We had James Cone came to our little college at Alma, so I met Jim when I was a sophomore.
I just want you to know, I think I've already bought your memoir that's not even out yet 3 times in this conversation. When I read people, if I read too much of them at some point, I have very vivid dreams. And after maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, I was talking with Aaron, one of your former students, who'll also be at Beer Camp, and he was telling about getting the study with you. And that night, Aaron and I and other people I know that went to Union, not even all at the same time, like Adam Clark is in this seminar. So you have and then you also have like the undead version of Union presidents and professors, and they're all in there, except you were leading the seminar, and it was called Lord Gifford's Holy Ghosting. And you're using just Gifford lectures to tell the story of the problem of God and modernity.
Yeah.
And apparently you've been teaching the class, I guess this is a post-eschaton opportunity, because you've been teaching it, and every year you pick 5 different ones and bring these Gifford lecturers back to class, on their day. And part of the spectacle was that you would end up knowing what they said in their Giffords better than they did. So they started to defer. And it was just one of these dreams sitting there, because I love the Gifford lectures. When I was at the University of Edinburgh, I did the thing where you go find out what room certain ones were given in and go read it in there.
Wow.
Just so later in life, if I ever got to teach the class, I could, here's me in lockdown sneaking into New College to take a picture where Reinhold doing this thing. Not that you have to go teach this class, but knowing you've written the whole history of social ethics, the 3-volume history of liberal theology. You wrote how the Kantian and Hegelian tradition moved through modern theology and reshaped the concept of God, and this kind of thing. If you were thinking of the big questions or big kind of eruptions of potential, and just coming to use the word God in reference to anything through modernity, when so many people are coming to theology, again, out of a very conservative context, or maybe for the first time even raising the God question in our context, how would you kind of invite them into this history that has animated you as you got to know the story of the liberal theological tradition and the modern wrestling around the concept of God and all that? What's kind of the outline or the big moves in your head to give a framework for someone if they wanted to go hang out in the story?
Well, firstly, I have to say that Gifford's dream is fantastic. Oh my goodness. It's even a thought for a project, I mean, there's definitely something there, Trip. You could do it. I can see it. And also, we need to note here, that even since you've had the dream, there's now a new installment, and what how that story would have to be told. How
Oh yeah.
do it? Since of course
Your colleague John Tatamil and I have a running text thread as we watched Cornell's lectures, and I'm like, well, if y'all can manage to get him on the podcast, I told him I'd even talk to him about his presidential campaign if he let me ask questions about the Gifford lectures.
Oh well, we need to make that happen. Then that's doable. But yes, I mean they're the bluesiest Giffords ever given. It's just the whole other line, but also familiar because of course Cornell has this argument about pre-Socratics and what Plato's good for and all of that in his head as well. It's the bluesy side of all of that, and then what gets repressed, what we don't talk about when you have just such a heavy kind of rationalist overlay, the pressure of all this rationalist, or if then that turns into a story about how, well, what the history of Western philosophy is the conflict between rationalism and empiricism. Well, of course, that thing's been done over and over, done to death. I think, and this is one of the things I told Cornell as we were having our back and forth for the past year about what he was going to do in these Giffords. I said, you need to take a look at Susan Nyman's Giffords, because she did do something like this in a way that would be probably the closest parallel to what I knew was coming in his. And that is because, for her, it was what keeps getting repressed. And it's not just, bluesy funk where we're trying to resist denial and domestication. It's evil itself. The Nyman argument is that Western rationalism is a kind of conspiracy against sort of dealing with the evil that's in us and all around us, and trying to push it out and keep it at the margin, keep it down, even in ourselves. And so I think that was the closest parallel there to what Cornell did. But of course, with Cornell is it's always even more existential with him. It's the kind of story of his engagement with all that's sort of not missing, and all these philosophers who just live in their heads and just kind of privilege abstract arguments about, say, how the mind intuits objects of sense data and the like, right? And I would say, it probably matters that Cornell just isn't as entertained by that argument as you and I are, right? We still can't really quite turn over and go to sleep that night unless we've kind of thought our way through.
Some people get excited with the word prehension and think that that's like worthy of at least an hour of fun conversation.
Oh, well, so here, you will recall when Whitehead came up in his Giffords, he did do a little run there. This was in a discussion period. It wasn't in the talk, but he got a little bit into it there. But then it was all mostly to make fun of it, right? To say, oh, well, the kind of recognition to get a great thinker here, and yet a great thinker who's just so at a certain level and in a way that just is not where you have to strain to see anything at all being said about what for Cornell is just the main thing. It's the main stuff. How do you deal with evil and oppression and dispossession? And just then there's just sheer kind of funk of life where you're mobilizing resources to hold it off. And yes, hold it off, but not in denial that that's what you're doing. All the time. Those are the thinkers that kind of speak to him. And so, as you know, and he said it there in a lecture, or whatever, 5 or 6, I think it was 5. The American literature is mostly a story about of innocence, of a kind of determined pursuit of innocence that just sort of screens this out. And so, of course, the Americans that he does like are, Eugene O'Neill and Melville, where you have great figures in American literature who can't be described in that way. It's not a pursuit of innocence. But mostly we're concerned to just, we want to be okay. So I do think that's a way in, just kind of, if it's existential in the way that it is for Cornell, that just opens up all of this. Because indeed, Cornell always had meaning questions that show in virtually everything he writes, because he was already that person who had all these questions and had this way of looking at the world when he arrived at Harvard University as an 18-year-old, and has been on that path ever since.
Can I ask a
relate to that. I relate to all of it, but mine is a different story.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, no, I want to hear you kind of let people that don't maybe even know what the lecture series is, let alone why we would get excited as philosophically minded theologians about the possibility of doing a class on its history. But for that, I want to ask a question. I mean, you brought up something where I thought there was an opening in what Cornell was doing to connect with more of the Giffords than than he wanted to let on. Part of it's because there was a certain performative nature that the blues, jazz, funk, those kinds of things are a reintroduction of the tragic, suffering, the communal as the site for this kind of, I don't know, ontological theopoetics of sorts. But he said, I think it's in lecture 3, where he talks about the need to integrate scientific inquiry, values, and social solidarity. And there's been so much criticism in philosophy of science about kind of taking Galileo's framing as normative, or Whitehead's bifurcation of nature, or that whole criticism. And I just thought you could make that criticism right there to do the integration. And when Whitehead talks about the 3 essential insights of the Western tradition, that's an Adventure of Ideas. He talks about the Platonic persuasive power over the coercive, right? Which is that resonates with the way he's reading Plato in the resistance of Plato to the logos type thinking, but the poetics and the new form of making. Then he says the cross of Jesus as the site of revelation.
Oh yeah.
And the third one is mutual participation of the Trinity gets extended to all. But because he never got around in the way, I guess, our a priori kind of commitments as the kind of scholars we are to answering the integration of science, value, and solidarity. I just thought Whitehead's system has opportunities for expansion and updating, because just the way he even frames the 3 Western insights are already framed thinking the kind of criticism he's performing jazz blues style.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, and beautifully put. Liberation theology is in Cornell and is driving him in a way that he can never acknowledge as such. He could never say yes, being described as some kind of liberation theologian, even though it happens all the time. He's introduced all the time on these podcasts as a theologian, and I'll watch it. Sometimes, he'll flush a little bit and he'll correct the introducer, and sometimes he just lets it pass. But it's important to him to say not a theologian, right? And the why of it is always this argument that actually is not true, right? The argument is that theology is about rationalizing things, right? Theology is about trying to make sense of something that mostly doesn't make sense. And then when you're trying to make sense, evoking your categories and refining them and sharpening them, making concepts sort of describe the world, then you invest too much significance, importance in the kind of so-called truth of these concepts, and everything that really matters ends up getting repressed. And so it ends up becoming a kind of an idol and a kind of instrument, kind of leads you astray. And so he can never admit that he's doing something that's actually theological in some way, even in riffs that are just straight out of Black Church, where it's just pure sermonic. That he's gone into, he's going to say that, it's not theological, because he's got to have this particular sort of definition of what theology is, even though, of course, it isn't necessarily. Reinhold Niebuhr, my God, come on. Reinhold Niebuhr is a theologian. Reinhold Niebuhr virtually made paradox a criterion of truth. You can't say that, that Niebuhr, that's just a rationalizing project, right? And James Cone either. James Cone writes a whole book, Crossing the Lynching Tree, and theologizes about the cross on every page, and yet not in a way in which you end up with a doctrine of the cross. No, he says all the doctrines of the cross, they all distort the truth of the cross, that they turn the cross into some subject of doctrinal desiccation that then becomes falsifying. So the objection that Cornell has to theology, Jim had too. And yet Jim is just a quintessential theologian. Cornell will not own up to that, that those of us who are in theology are doing something that, that includes him. He always sort of cuts that off. And because if he were to say, okay, I recognize that some kinds of theology actually could or even do pass the muster of this criteria that I've been laying out here in the Giffords, well, then you'd have to, then you'd have to say, okay, here's my version. Here's what I do with Whitehead or the like. And yet, he got clear early on. He doesn't want that. All right, he's not going to be saddled with that. In a way that's kind of analogous to the fact that he's never taught in a department of philosophy per se. Anyway, he's never, even though his PhD is in philosophy from Princeton, he's never taught in a philosophy department where he would do what philosophers do for the same reason, right? That he can't do what he does if he has to, start out with a book by Kant and then one by Hegel, and then what critics of Kant and Hegel say about them, and so on. That's just, to him, that's just a loss. It's a waste of time.
Well, I would love to talk to him about it, because John Totomel and I's text exchange back and forth was just like, well, I really think you could add 3 paragraphs to each one of these, and then everyone see how it's connected to the larger philosophical theological conversation going on in the academy. But when you think of the I don't know what you would want to call it, the dominant stream of the Giffords in modernity, can you kind of help us understand how those figures like Hegel and Kant and the arrival of historical consciousness, scientific inquiry, how does that change what we talk about when we talk about God? Like, if liberal theology emerges in modernity, help us understand what that soil was when thinking about it historically. What were the changes and what was the reorientation that could give birth to, hundreds of years of people asking the questions in a particular way?
Yeah. Well, I have operated on all these liberal theology books I've written with basically a threefold definition of what it is. Although it can just as readily be a sixfold, because my third category is a kind of bundle of things. But the first one is the principle of intellectual freedom, that it comes from, and here you can read it straight into the Kantian argument that enlightenment, if it means nothing at all, it means having the courage to use your own reason. That an external authority cannot be allowed to compel or establish the truth of anything. Per se, that whatever we believe religiously, credibly, has to be able to pass the muster of our own reason and critically interpreted experience. And that is the main thing. And that's a revolution. That had not happened in theology before. We've got all manner of ways of sort of linking to pre-modern theologies that are terribly important to me. I've mentioned Logos theology several times here. But all theologies did operate within a certain one house of authority or another, until you get this movement in theology that is quintessentially associated with Kant and Schleiermacher and Hegel, that generation, where they're just quite explicitly saying that no external authority can compel or establish what we believe about anything. We've got to proceed on some other basis. And so therefore, it's not to say that Scripture can't still be authoritative. It can still be authoritative within liberal theologies, but it's authoritative within Christian experience. It's not as something from without, where just because something is stated in the Bible, therefore you have to believe it. That is now out, and you have to be able to operate on some other basis. And so the first paradigmatic sort of work of modern theology, where we're saying, okay, the thing has been realized. It's actually happening right here. In some way we can identify. We usually go for Schleiermacher, on religion, speeches to its cultured despisers, 1799, where, yes, the problem with liberal theology is right there in the subtitle, that the agenda is being generated by the despisers, by the cultural critics of all of it, people who don't believe anything. They're the ones kind of setting the agenda. But the reason we go to that book, and not to some 18th century rationalist who long preceded Schleiermacher, where they're already sort of working critically at trying to understand, and deconstructing the myth that's in Scripture and so on. All of that had been going on long before Schleiermacher, all through the 18th century. But the reason we sort of go for that Schleiermacher book as where we see modern theology just now in full bloom actually occurring is that Schleiermacher never tries to seal an argument or establish one by appealing to some authority. It just never happens. There are places where you think, okay, maybe now he's going to kind of reach for somebody or something from Scripture where he's going to try to, in case I haven't persuaded you yet, here's what Thomas Aquinas said, or here's what the Bible, and he just never does it. Or he's just trying to persuade you that you think you're not Christian, you think you're not religious. Well, look at it this way. And now it's all in the mode of a kind of critically interpreted experience where religion itself is understood as being a kind of way of explicating religious experience. The only thing you could even point to as maybe an exception is that one time he takes a run at Spinoza. Says, "Blessed Spinoza," right? That's the closest thing to an authority and a kind of external authority in that book. So that's the exemplification of the first thing, of taking seriously that kind of overthrow of external authority, sort of driving what happens in theology. And then the second thing is the principle of mediation between two things, where all these liberal theologians, they're all members of churches. The problem of the church is ongoing for all of them. They're all in contexts where they're having to deal with the problem of overbelief. People who just believe too much, people who believe something just on the basis of dogma or literalism and the like. And so the problem of dogmatic overbelief in the churches is always one side of what they're having to deal with. In speaking to it, being in context where you're trying to pull the churches to a place where people realize, oh no, we can relativize this top-heavy authority and still be okay. We can still live the faith and be Christian and follow Jesus and all of it. Believe in God on some other basis. So that's always a front. But then on the other side is indeed the culture despisers, the culture of disbelief. And the thing about this whole liberal theological tradition, you can see it going on for 300 years. It's always been like this, that liberal theologians like John Cobb and you and me, we're in these church traditions where we're in context where often we're dealing with folks who are, very conservative and needing to operate out on the basis of external authority and have issues with, if that's sort of taken from them. And yet, for all of that, even though that's part of our life is dealing with that issue in the church, the overbelief issue, we actually spend more of our time dealing with these culture disbelievers over here, where indeed these people who don't believe anything or believe almost nothing end up setting so much of the agenda and maybe even defining so much of the ethos of what our work becomes, which is how we even come off any longer, because we're always kind of mediating between these two things. And I said that is constitutive. That's in liberal theology, you always have that dynamic. That's always going on. This argument that no, actually, for the faith to have a future, it has to operate between these two poles. And then the third thing is a kind of bundle of things that come from these first two things. So that if we've made these two commitments, or they're both in play, then there's certain things that just come from that. Such as, for example, we're going to let science explain the physical world. We don't get ourselves in conflict with how natural science explains the physical world. Or indeed, we accept the historical critical approach to the Bible, or just biblical criticism per se. And there's a certain kind of concern about relevance, got to make it relevant to the modern world. So there's that sort of bundle of things that come in the third thing. And I think this explicitly sort of liberal tradition of theology is the one that always has these markers And I do believe, as you know, that I think the U.S. American, the North American sort of tradition of liberal theology is actually, as ironic as this can be to say this, has turned out to be the most creative, most many-sided, most ongoing of them all. It just keeps refashioning, reinventing itself, refusing to just let a late 19th century way of defining what it is, which usually means Harnack. So it's German nationalists somehow get to define what it is, and so then you dismiss it. And no, I think if it's actually something that's been in existence for 300 years and keeps redefining itself, refashioning itself, trying to make itself better, trying to purge the bad stuff that's in it that creeps in, trying to find the best way of getting its bearings and theologizing the world, and speaking to certain classic perennials that are just always there, where you never really solve the problem. You just agree to keep struggling with the problem, like divine reality and evil. Yeah, you never solve that one. Although I would say, and then this is where I'll end on this run here, that is, as you know, so many people have come into the Whiteheadian stream because indeed that was the issue for them, of just, can I believe in any God at all in the amidst just so much suffering and evil, that there's just no God I can believe in that isn't some kind of an answer that I can live with regard to that issue. And indeed, that is one of the virtues, attractions, stronger points, I would say, of the whole Whiteheadian stream. Because here you've got, from the get-go, a way of defining the faith and defining God in a way where you just don't have that omnipotent God who has all the power, that is, who therefore sets up the problem of how can I believe in God at all if there's all this evil. You just don't have a concept of divine reality that has that kind of an omnipotence, that's such that. And here you're just even kind of thinking through the fact that God has no hands. God is doing the best that God can in a world in which we indeed do have freedom, and that the world of things has a kind of integrity on its own. That therefore God is maybe a factor in trying to bring into being, lure into being a better world, but is not standing over it in a way that could simply, on a vertical way, make something else happen. So many people have come into the Whiteheadian stream just on those terms, and I think that's a very, very good reason to come into it.
Yeah, that picture is extremely helpful, and one of the features of it that I wonder how you see our current cultural moment maybe shaping differently is that kind of principle of mediation. I mean, when you think of over dogmatic belief in the culture despisers, and then what is it like to think in the public square or to articulate the faith? It's one thing if you think of like Paul Tillich and the kind of response he got, and he's like, let's talk about the God beyond God and this kind of maneuver. And that feels different if you're reading it in a place where Christianity or some type of theism is culture dominant. So then the way he kind of retrieves Luther by, recapitulating the radical insight again in our culture, it's like, oh, wow. But how do you see that mediation functioning when our cultural inheritance is more diffuse? You get the rise of the nuns, multi-religious belonging, the expansive humanism as a viable option, and this kind of thing, when the dialectic might be between the culture despisers and the religious dogmatically ambivalent. Because I think that's a place where in volume 3 of your liberal history of liberal theology, that you kind of, where you're making the plea for the need to do constructive liberal theology within the confessional tradition, and that oftentimes our dialogue partners have been our philosopher, scientist, historian, humanities friends in the university who are the culture despisers. And then in a sense, it's led to theological laryngitis among the church. But does that make sense how this new shift has changed and how that might reorient the vocation of a liberal Christian theologian?
Yes. Firstly, I'd say, Paul Tillich and Reinhold Niebuhr are tremendously important to me. I think with them and through them all the time. And I think Tillich was just one of the very great theologians of all time, and who so much of his work preaches today, speaks to us, is still just so important and thoughtful and true. But of course, with regard to this issue that you're pressing on here, yeah, the difference in context is just so dramatic between their time and ours. I have this gripe against both of them. Both of them were too accepting of and kind of content with their standing in a U.S. American story that seems to have triumphed in the 1950s. And I don't see a critique of empire in there with either of them. They're both a little too content where they are, and both of them ridiculing of mere liberals and of people who are idealistic. Both of them retained enough of their kind of leftover Marxism from where they used to be, that they held on to this sort of Marxist, not just critique, but dismissal of liberal idealism in a way that then I think was destructive for, and certainly not helpful for, the concrete reality that you were pointing to. And in both cases, they do think of mainline liberal Protestantism as just this, this enormous fortress that will just go on. I mean, Reinhold Niebuhr blasts away at, ridicules it. I mean, just scathing ridicule of liberal Protestantism, and rarely even bothering to finish a page by saying, well, of course, this is my group, and I still wanted to hang in there and and move on. He never says that kind of thing, right? It's just to him, it's just a given how that he has this kind of stewardship role in American society, and that half the people in the United States belong to liberal Protestant churches. I mean, it's just so taken for granted to him that he just thinks he can ridicule it all the time and not have no real concern for how are you a steward of even kind of holding on to it, taking care of it, being a guardian of it, trying to, identify with it and say, yeah, some of its faults are in me, and we need to nurture it. And so, yes, what's coming through with me is, firstly, I kind of resent that they are not, I have an argument about how the radical wings of the social gospel, the black social gospel, white social gospel, those are my exemplars of that generation. People who don't let a Marxist argument get in the way of saying we need all the social ethical idealism we can muster in order to save what's best in our institutions. But to say, yes, what's best in our institutions, I spent my whole life sort of in them, trying to, with the belief that saving, reinventing, nurturing, holding on to progressive institutions that have my values, that have the beliefs that brought me into this world to begin with, taking care of them, making sure that they hang in there, that they don't disappear. It's enormously important to me. That's why I stayed in them. And at a place where, like where I am now, it has taken the path more like what you are suggesting. We made a commitment to, we were even saying it about ourselves, that we were interfaith in a way that was a little bit aspirational. We weren't really quite there yet. It was our aspiration, but of course it takes a while to change the culture of a place. It takes a while just to make new appointments that change a place. So we were already saying it about ourselves in a way that wasn't quite true while we're trying to live into it. But meanwhile, oh my goodness, here come all these students who took it seriously. They're unions interfaith. Oh my goodness, now they're showing up from all kinds of places that are just not the usual place that Union students would have come from. So now we're trying to live into it. And if you look at what our curriculum looks like today, as opposed to even just 10 years ago, it's almost unrecognizable from what was then. So we are trying with all the same, be a place that carries this whole story of what we've always been. It makes sense that we ended up where we are now, and yet to be, progressive religion today just can't be what it was 20 years ago, or certainly not what it was in Tillich's time. You're in a different kind of cultural matrix, and so being able to speak to and to even do theology the way that Schleiermacher says you should do it, which is to understand religious ideas themselves as sort of products of religious experience. Well, what are the religious experiences that just even brought us together here, so that here we are in the same room? Well, that's what we're explicating, all the time, and often in a kind of catch-up mode, so that it has ended up it has changed the way I teach. I just don't teach the same. Even I fundamentally changed how I teach 4 years ago. And just how a class goes now is not what I did for most of my career. Now, I make everybody write something on Moodle every week. And they've got to have it all. It has to be in before we hit class, whether it's online or in the class. And then whatever came in that day, that's what we're going to talk about in class. And so I'm always in this kind of hurry up mode just before I walk into class, because all this stuff just came in, and now I'm trying to see the patterns and the like, to get to be able to speak to what just came in on Moodle today. And yes, I've always got ideas in my head. Well, if we don't get to Kant or something, I've got to make sure at some point I get into a lecture that gets into backstop something that didn't come in on Moodle this week. But mostly, I'm just responding to what came in. So this whole issue about, we used to, in the past, we always had this question pedagogically about what we call feedback, right? How do we make sure we give feedback? So we're not just giving, lectures or teaching the same course over and over. How do we give feedback? Well, now, oh my God, my whole class is just nothing but feedback in the old sense, which I don't think of it that way. It's just, I think this is what you have to do in a place that's as different from what it was when I came as it is today.
What's fascinating to me about this transition and getting to talk to so many people that are figuring out what that means is their vocation as theologians or historians. Like, you're handing on a tradition. You've always assumed and are aware as scholars that it's in process historically, and yet it's not like anyone's describing with any confidence what that trajectory looks like. Like, even if you think of at the end of speeches where Schleiermacher gets hints at like the evolution of the faith beyond Christianity and things, that's one thing to say when you're in Germany then. To say now, the cultural privilege of the church makes it more uncomfortable. And my experience is similar to yours in the sense of it took that whole learning of the story and traditions in detail to even imagine seeing yourself within it because of your own deep passions about the world, your intellectual curiosity and stuff, like knowing that story. And so I always have this thing where I don't think I would have stayed a Christian, let alone been a theologian, if I wasn't forced to take year-long versions of all the core classes. Like, if I didn't take a year of theology and get to know the tradition and how it works, and a year of church history, and a year on each testament, like all those things gave me the ability to see myself in a tradition where I have the very openness that oftentimes performing it as a scholar, I don't ever know if I'm handing off the tradition where you have to learn to join the stream in a thick and rich enough way that it would have compelled me. And I know multiple theologians that have this, this cross pressure in you, right? Like, if I never was required to read City of God, but was okay with a very with the feminist criticism to his doctrine of sin and against Niebuhr, and didn't have to read Augustine and Niebuhr closely. And Phil Clayton hand me a paperback and say, I got to page 10 and decided I'd give you another opportunity because City of God deserves more attention before you can dismiss it. Right? Like, I wouldn't get to a place where I think I'm a part of that tradition. And yet it's that very kind of diving into the tradition deeply that helped me find a place to be in it that is being cut out of so much of theological education. I don't know what to do with it. I just think seminary would not be compelling to me today in a way that it was when I had these year-long classes, wrote 3 or 4 times as much, and read twice as much, and this kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, you're naming something that we go round and round on in our theological studies department. This past spring, I walked into the opening class of my course on Kant, Hegel, and modern theology. And the first thing I said, I'm already feeling a little bit apologetic, Kant and Hegel, oh my God. Walk in and say, well, this is the most canonical course I teach. And they burst out in applause. And a couple people said, finally, or things like that, finally, oh, good. And I thought, oh my God, that wasn't the response I was expecting, because I've walked in with this little bit of a defensive, and yet that was the response. And I thought, okay, we're not quite getting it right. If we think we're calibrating it, that is, that's real. That's what you're just describing. They were giving it to me right then. And indeed, I had an utterly wonderful class with a room full of people who were just as determined as could be to dig into Kant and Hegel, because they've seen these names all over the place, and they know they just don't understand enough to be able to get what they're reading, and they want it. That they realize this is going to be something that's formative and enabling in a way that's so far beyond just some postmodern critique of them that you read somewhere.
To me, there's a sense that the liberal tradition, and you raised this in your first point about reflecting on the principle of intellectual freedom, that Kant crystallizes the inability of an external authority to just justify God talk, and it's even bigger than that, to justify truth talk.
Yeah.
And that kind of critique to an external authority is the ground for the emergence of the liberal theological tradition. And I wonder if part of our predicament is the confessional shape of the liberal tradition in early modernity hits a whole nother snag once the suspicion isn't just of external authority, it's even internal, right? Once false consciousness fully emerges and you don't know that you're transparent to yourself. And there are all these ways it shows up, masters of suspicion and such. But at the birth of false consciousness, then what was careful humility and thoughtful delineation and hesitation and tentativeness to the limits of theological statement and locating yourself in situation and tradition before speaking, all of those things, as culture more internalizes false consciousness, or like in that no one's transparent to themselves, the same language is experienced as a lack of confidence as opposed to a sign of it. And so and I haven't read your Anglican book, but one of the responses I've seen, and this is definitely in Europe and in America, has been an increased role of the liturgical traditions, where they kind of function as like a liturgical theopoetic space to hold a tradition that you're never sure exactly, when you're crossing the metaphorical fingers or not, or even what that would mean. But there's a receiving of the tradition through the liturgy that opens up space to be grounded in a particularity. But it's a deep enough grounding you aren't growing anxious about where you draw boundaries anymore. When I see students that get really pumped about something that's canonical or like or when I taught confirmation for adults in Los Angeles for years, they were the ones that never been religious, were the ones that were like, can we have more Bible study? I want to hear the history of the church. And you didn't have to tell any of them that this is a human tradition. It is a social construct. Like, you didn't have to tell them. They know that.
Yeah.
But like, what's animating is like, it's compelling enough for you that it's like, it's so beautiful to you. You hope it's true and you're going to live as if it is. And so tell me why. And if my response after that is, well, Kant has already drawn this gap between practical reason and you do this whole thing. I feel like that deflationary move that made sense in early modernity has generated a kind of like theological weakness in liberal Protestantism, where as culture internalizes the internal critique or internal suspicion to authority, then what's needed are these like energetic performances of a tradition. Because no, you don't need to put your name on the top of a paper and then go tell us who you are and how you're located because we read your name. When you walk in a pulpit, we know it's you, but you're standing in this tradition, but it is what you're saying. Like, we don't have to say those things anymore because no one would believe in that. And so I feel like there's a methodology question for the liberal tradition that takes seriously both like that whole mediating energy and the intellectual freedom. And then like, what are the psychological sciences and understanding of religious practice and community and formation, the nature of belief and imagination and how it emerges as humans. Like, in what ways then would we take seriously the spiritual technologies that are just part of being human in order to form communities where they might actually give themselves to the way of Jesus, or let the same mind be in them that was in Christ Jesus, who didn't count, like we haven't taken our commitment to reason, rationality, science serious enough to then go, what is it like to have communities where someone executed by the state is confessed and celebrated for his treason weekly, and you confess your sin next to the person that canceled out your vote? And why the hell is that the most beautiful time of the year? Like, when you do that. Anyway, sorry. Thank you for coming to my TED Talk.
God, that's wonderful. Firstly, I would say that one reason that Schleiermacher is important to me is he sees the importance of the church. He's in the church and sees that this whole critical development needs to succeed in the church. Otherwise, it's lost. If we were just kind of flotsam within the culture, well, it'll just end up reproducing the culture. And of course, that is what he had to overcome, because there is already a liberal theological tradition before Schleiermacher came along. And in Germany, that's the Kantian stream. In fact, the original liberals were all Kantians. And they thought for the next century that they owned it, right? That the only Kantians qualified as liberal Christians. And that is a non-church, usually anti-church conception of liberal religion. So that is it's a possibility. It's one way of proceeding, but one which is just ripe for whatever is happening in the culture, or German nationalism, or whatever. And I think this is an enormously important thing about Schleiermacher, is that he is actually inaugurating this stream that says, no, it has to be grounded in the church in order to live and just continue to be something at its best. And we're gonna fight for the church. So that continues from him onward. It certainly is the case. I mean, the liberal Protestant churches, they never reproduce themselves, and they never outgrew their ethnic families of origin. So just those two things alone, never grew beyond your own ethnic families of origin, and then just didn't even replace yourselves. Well, that ends up to falling off a cliff in the 1960s just by itself. And then when that happened, they did lose this capacity to draw people from coming out of more conservative evangelical traditions. I mean, that was the third dynamic for so long, is that they were always sort of catching people who really did grow up in something that was very substantive and had answers to everything. And now when you're trying to kind of shuck off some of that, you went and became a Presbyterian or Episcopalian or something. And often that had a class angle as well. You grew up in some church that wasn't one of the mainliners, but then you grew up and, became a Presbyterian. And then that was lost. That third dynamic of kind of what continues kind of strengthen. The liberal Protestantism that just Niebuhr took for granted was just forevermore. No, that just fell off a cliff. And so then it became an issue of kind of coping in a culture that isn't like the one that liberal Protestantism grew up on and thought was just forever. I think this sort of danger of just letting the culture have its way with you, it is inherent in the liberal option. I think if it's not rooted, if it isn't holding fast to things that Schleiermacher himself was very aware of, are important, that will happen, such that you get, when Tillich lines out how theology proceeds, he says, well, the culture asks the questions and theology gives the answers, right? And to Karl Barth, that is exactly what theology must not do. If you go that way, you'll just end up with a cultural theology. That's just a kind of a thin veneer, a kind of thinly religious way of naming what's already going on in the culture. And that has no substance, and it'll have a hard time standing up to what's actually wrong, not only with your society, but with you.
Part of the difficulty for the Barthian tradition in America in response is that so much of that theological energy got hooked up with increasingly different philosophical assumptions that just narrowed what the God talk referred to.
Yeah.
So, if you're sitting there defending like creedal orthodoxy, but you've managed to write 2 or 3 books explaining how theological language is kind of unrelated to the world everyone lives in, and it's just a doxological structure for a form of life, or when we say God is creator, it doesn't say anything about the world directly, like that. So there's this sense in so many of the mainline traditions that those who talk most about God's deep desire for justice, reconciliation, and such in the material world are the ones that have so little to say about God and are most uncomfortable with confessional language. And then those that the confessional language and the liturgy and these things, they deflate the amount of traction the tradition has with the rest of the world, but can preserve a kind of doxological unity. That in that space, it's hard to think, what's the next iteration that does both, in the sense of like wanting to talk about our shared reality, and that means it's political, material, scientific, historical traction, and one where what you have to say is responding to an existential orientation that reality is expressed in a particular way in the person of Jesus. What he said, did, and endured shapes it. And okay, here's the historical vignette I'd love to hear you unpack, because I just finished, I've been working with Jeff Pugh on it's a short book on the life of Bonhoeffer, and we're doing an audio documentary on his life. And so his time at Union, getting to go through all of the letters between him and Niebuhr, hearing about the way he reports to his mentors at home about his experience in New York, the friendship with Frank Fisher. Like I always had a relationship with Bonhoeffer because I was handed a book in middle school, and I was like, well, at least he takes us seriously, but getting to read it all. And he writes back when he ends up at Union, and he says the students, this is his quote, the students are completely clueless with respect to what dogmatics is really about. They're not familiar with even the most basic questions. They become intoxicated with liberal and humanistic phrases, are amused at fundamentalists, and yet are not even up to their level of fundamentalists when it goes to theology. And he goes on like, they just giggle when I bring up Luther, and this kind of thing. And between his relationship with Niebuhr and Frank Fisher and Abyssinian Baptist Church, in retrospect, that period becomes this shift where he says from the phraseological to the real. So there's something about that Union energy. And you can hear him describing something that someone right now, if a Barthian you spent too much time at Union, they would say. And so I wonder, like, thinking of that kind of dogmatic energy showing up in the cauldron of Union. What is that Christian realist vision from Niebuhr, that movement energy that's there? What would that sound like today? Like, maybe tell the story of that moment and whatever the way Niebuhr and his relationship and such. But to me, that move of the phraseological to the real, where there's a different orientation of the theology of the word in the present and a different liberal inheritance or progressive inheritance. Like, I want to figure that out. But I'm going to do that in my 50s, Gary. But like, as a historian, when you think of that moment and his time there and those traditions, like, what comes up? And then kind of in the present, you could think of something similar coming up with Union.
Wow. Firstly, of course, Bonhoeffer grew up in a high bourgeois family that's culture Protestant at most. Couple, his mother, culture Protestant. Mostly they're past religion in his family. And so he does have this spiritual streak. His mother wasn't surprised when he ends up going on this path, and he lost a brother in the war. So there's a shattering event in the family during the First World War that starts him on a path that his older brothers are just embarrassed by. Oh my God, you're going to go back to the church. So that is not inconsequential. That he comes from a family like that, and so when he ends up training to be a theologian, it's with no real Christian background. He hasn't grown up in the church at all. It's all just in his head. Although it's belief issues. I mean, do I believe in God? Am I some sort of Christian at all? It's all sort of in his head. And we think of liberal theology as having crashed during that period because of, the First World War and all that. But of course, it took a whole generation for liberal theology to fall off its pedestal. In Germany, it's Harnackian liberals who have all the distinguished chairs in Germany, including Harnack himself at Berlin, which is where Bonhoeffer went to do write his doctoral dissertation, and under Reinhold Seeberg as well. So he's just finished his dissertation. He's quintessentially trained in liberal theology. The point I want to make about that is he could only have been a liberal theologian in his context, because that's the only one that's just even respectable enough that any Bonhoeffer would have been able to even just put up with, where it's just even tolerable that he's gone now on to a theological career. They can barely stand it anyway, but at least he's gone into some version of it that, of course, has very high cultural standing in Germany. It's Harnack and all that. So that's what he's been trained in his graduate education, except, of course, this is the very period when Karl Barth made his big supernova entrance into the scene, and he's reading Barth, and he's intoxicated by Barth, and he does buy most of this Barthian sort of argument about how, liberal Protestantism is just a way of kind of baptizing the culture, and especially in this context. Are you kidding? Just coming out of World War I? Yes, these liberals like Harnack have disgraced themselves by wedding themselves to German nationalism, and now have just utterly disgraced theology itself. So that's what Bonhoeffer believed while he's writing this dissertation under liberals. A wonderful little book called Act and Being. And he barely finishes that book. And it's very high-flying and philosophical. It's quite wonderful, actually. But he does have this question, like, God, what does any of this mean to the actual real world? Yes, Barth stirred this great following, and I think Barth's a great theologian. He admires Barth, and yet there's a critique above the otherworldliness of Barth's answer to the problem of act and being, that he's barely turned this thing in. He's already got a criticism of it. So where is he going to go? Well, there's one place that actually claims to make this connection, that actually goes from theology to the world. There's one place that does social ministry in a way that's, apparently the model, the place to go. That's all he's going on when he came to Union in 1930. It's like, okay, he's going to come here and interact with these Union theologians, and they've got something that he doesn't have, and he assumes they'll they'll have theology in common, they'll have common discourse, but he'd be able to learn from them about how you kind of make the connection between an academic theological world and a church world, and just the problems of real life, where you're speaking to the disconnect. That's what Union should be good for. Well, you read choice quotes on that, especially what you just read was his to Rubler, right? Those letters are just absolutely blistering. Just lays out the stupidity of these classes he's going to. He's going to Niebuhr's class, sitting there with Niebuhr, taking a few notes at first, and then shaking his head and putting down his pen and then just staring imperiously at Niebuhr. And of course, Niebuhr just got to Union in 1928. This is still in the period where Niebuhr says, I felt like a fraud standing before a class, because Bonhoeffer has 2 doctorates and Niebuhr doesn't have any. But Niebuhr is feeling this contempt. Bonhoeffer says, at the end of one class, Bonhoeffer says, is this a theology school or a school for politicians, right? And so that's an argument they have right from the beginning, where Niebuhr comes back and says, you are just too Lutheran, right? You have this idea of, there's just the doctrine is just too self-evident to you. And now you think it's a matter of theology is about doctrine and now applying it to the world. Because as far as Bonhoeffer is concerned, he's going to all these classes that are supposedly theological classes, and yet no theology is happening here. His argument is that here at Union, theology has become a handmaiden of social ethics. It's actually social ethics. It's the social gospel that's in the driver's seat here. And then anything that's theological at all is just kind of a subset. It's just kind of a commentary. It's subordinate to what that is. And so to him, what he immediately sees, which is in all those blistering things he says in those letters, is that, oh my God, I have seen how far the kind of winning wing out can go. Because at least back home, at least back in Germany, those liberals, theology is still, an enterprise of very considerable sort of import here. It's a field where you can recognize that we still got treatment of doctrines, and especially Paul. Oh, that's one of the things he says about Union. He says they just sneer at Paul. He said they have the slightest idea how great Paul is, because they just think they're so far beyond him. But Bonhoeffer, that constellation of things that constitutes Niebuhr, where it's a political discourse with some Christianity in it, and it's a kind of liberal theology, but not very theological. He just thought, oh my God, this is going to be the death of the church if this is all they've got to go on.
Bonhoeffer, in some sense, has his theology of the word is a lot easier for liberal theological tradition to engage than Barth's. And part of it is that he has so many very fertile but not clarified statements towards the end of his life, the outline for the book, letters and papers, these kinds of things. And I think the other is you see it even in those early dissertations, that the encounter with the other bears the encounter with the transcendent, right? So there's all like the word from outside is something image bearers bring to mind throughout, and so he ends up with a very kind of, he's a different dialogue partner for the liberal theological tradition than Karl Barth is sometimes. And I wonder how you see that kind of ongoing tension of the more liberal theological tradition and theology of the word playing out in American theology, where, for Bonhoeffer, where you get the God is no longer necessary, God's pushed out onto the cross, all that kind of thing. And at the same time, the Christ the sinner intensity keeps getting turned up, and the Christ event becomes more inclusive, and it becomes more determined by the experience of the underside and the perspective from below, and those kind of things, where it seems to me Bonhoeffer is rejecting a more expansive vision for the horizon of theology if it means just deflating the center of Christian conviction, so that you can be more inclusive. It seems to me he's like radicalizing the center so that the boundaries dissolve. And it reminds me of that line John Cobb had where he's like, if Christ is the center, then there are no boundaries, where he was using that to tell his own, in his memoir, his own experience. I'm interested how you see, like, what are the contours for kind of contemporary theology if we're going to give substance to the confessional tradition, the theologies of the word, and not pretend that we're theologizing in another history or another timeline or another place on it. Like, how does that self-revelation and resistance of an authoritarian tradition relate?
Okay, well, there are two parts there. Firstly, with regard to Bonhoeffer, I would say, yes, you're right. And Barth is so stringent about sola scriptura. It's a kind of magic key for him that unlocks everything. And it's why he fights with everybody in his own circle, the dialectical theology circle, because all these Barthians who aren't good enough Barthians because they just can't, they're not willing to just explicate a unique and authoritative scriptural witness, because that Barth is utterly serious about that theology should be nothing but the explication of this unique and authoritative revelatory witness, the Bible, period. And he doesn't trust Bonhoeffer on this issue because he can see Bonhoeffer isn't with him, because indeed Bonhoeffer is a Lutheran who's got ideas about an order of creation that's actually out there that you can also theologize. So Bonhoeffer is never quite a candidate to be a good enough Barthian from Barth's standpoint. But then almost nobody that Barth knows, there are all these supposed Barthian theologians, and all of them, one way or another, Brunner and all of them, Gogarten, they all have some way of making some kind of compromise with a Barthian, the fundamental Barthian argument that just doesn't work. Although Barth does try to be true to it. Barth does indeed always wrestle with the text, and he's always claiming that's all he's doing, except when he finally says, okay, I'm privileging the Reformed way of reading the Bible. It's not just coming to me direct. So I am allowing the Reformed tradition to be the kind of hermeneutic circle that allows me to sort of read the text the way I do. Although even then, he still holds in reservation the possibility that maybe the Reformed tradition has been wrong about this or that, because indeed he has an extreme version of the Reformed tradition that is, nobody ever was as stringent about natural theology as he was until he got there. And about sola scriptura as well. So that's the first thing. And so Bonhoeffer is an example of the problem that Barth had with some of his other followers, well, especially Brunner. That's the first thing. Secondly, I think with regard to this, Bonhoeffer said of himself, first I became a theologian, and then much later I became a Christian. And then at the end of my life, I became a contemporary, when he became a Christian during that period, and he wrote Cost of Discipleship, where just even ask, am I actually with Jesus? Have I actually ever taken the teaching of Jesus in some way, in a way that has a claim on me, that changes the way I treat other people and live in the world and look at the world? And he realized, no, I haven't. I came into it based on, some credible arguments, and it was also the way by which I got to be somebody in my family, because I've got issues with the rest of my family. Oh, they're all great. And how am I going to be great? I'm smarter than everyone else I know, but, in my family, I'm not the smartest person in the room. And so, negotiating all that that's what he did in his 20s. And so later, yes, he became a Christian. But then there's a stage beyond that as well. Because it's one thing to write The Cost of Discipleship, a lovely book-length commentary on what it would mean to take the Sermon on the Mount seriously. Except he's still arrogant Bonhoeffer, who still doesn't have spiritual practices, who still never really put himself in relationship to someone who could be something like a spiritual mentor to him, a spiritual guide, anything like that. And he's never the idea that he even needs spiritual practices. That whole kind of language just smacked of something that's Catholic and mystic to him until he's now just thrown upon himself in desolation, in prison, where now he's got a whole lot of time to kind of think and just live with himself, and sit in the yard and look at an anthill and be present in a way that he wasn't before, and it's just really kind of open now to an experience of God that he realizes it's been kind of shut out for him. Just wasn't really possible. He thought it was. Thought he was, because he's the way he's intellectualized it and then moralized it and confessing church and all his earnest activity shows how Christian he's being. And it's only near the end where he realizes, wow, I've never really been present to waiting to just even trying to discern what is God doing in this situation right now. Where is God right here? Sitting out in the backyard of the sun, with staring at this anthill, seeing the world in a way that if indeed it's all radiating the glory of God, how does that affect who I am sitting here? That only happened at the end, and he does realize, I think, if he'd ever allowed some religious tradition to shape him, to give him practices to be, and I'm now here. This is a bit of editorializing. I may be, I'm remembering your question two questions ago. I do think this is part of the draw of the liturgical traditions, where people end up coming to them because they realize, oh yeah, this isn't what I made fun of before. Oh my God, they just say the same thing over and over. So it's this kind of monotony of kind of liturgical kind of expression. No, what these ceremonies are supposed to be, they are invitations to enter prayer. Yes, you already know the words because they're written on your heart. And now you're repeating them with others. You are actually worshiping in a way that you're being cultivated, being nurtured in a spiritual life that you can't really get on your own. I do think that's the draw of liturgical traditions that have got all manner of other kinds of problems, but I think that's their strength.
His question, who is Jesus Christ for us today? How does that Christological phrasing of it change, given our cultural moment, the awareness of religious and non-religious diversity, and can or should a liberal theologian ask that question in that way today? How would they begin an answer if they're going to?
There is the problem that so many people who end up in liberal theology have come from a place where the only way of asking the question smacks of a kind of religious exclusivism, where there's only one way and everyone else is going to hell. And when that is what immediately assaults you, when that's just the first thing that flashes in your mind, because that's not just how you hear it, that's how you feel it. Now that just has to be interrogated. It has to be mediated in ways, and you say, where you're trying to just have to work on yourself to get out of it, if you're willing, if it means enough to you to do so. And so for many people, it's just the imprint of that kind of impression of having been told that when you grew up, whatever, the history of Christianity, all the bad things that the church did to people because in the name of there is only one way but Jesus. It affects me. I mean, I love the cathedral tradition of music, in the Church of England, but so much of it is just shot through with a kind of empire consciousness where they went from that one way to, yes, we're saving the world there by expanding the British Empire. And, that's in some of the loveliest Ralph Vaughan Williams hymnody that's out there. It reeks of that kind of conceptuality. So there is that kind of almost spiritual necessity, if that's what you're having to deal with, to be able to say, no, there's some deeper spiritual intuition in which that is truer to the very spirit of Jesus, that I recognize. It's what holds me here. It's what holds me in Christianity. That is truer than and a deeper pull than what all that stuff is. And yet, it's not like you're ever sort of done with the having to hold off and explain to say, no, that's not what it means to me. That's not what I mean when I say that is the question for me. Because indeed, I'll say it all right. Of course, that has always been my question. I've always been. That's how I got here. I'm drawn by this intrusion of the word into the world and the challenge that it presents to me. That very image of Jesus on a cross is just, to me, I was struck from that so long ago that there's something really strange and forbidding and repelling, but also fixating by this quite remarkable, stunning statement that this is the God figure in this religion. My God, what sort of religion is it that this is the symbol of it? It's counterintuitive, and yet it has held me all my life. And I was married to someone who was the same way. And yet when we reached the end, and it came time to plan her funeral, we didn't sing her favorite hymn and mine at her funeral, "Lift High the Cross," because that church was going to have a whole lot of folks in it who are Jewish or atheist or various kinds of religious disbelievers who simply could not have heard what it was for us. Love language about a Redeemer King. That's what it is to us. But you can't have a discursive moment before you're about to sing the thing at a funeral service. So we just we agreed, yeah, we're not gonna sing our hymn at that service, because then it would have an effect that's not what we need it to be here. And I think I feel that back and forth all the time. It used to be out on the road, I didn't really talk about being Christian. I just thought, if they invited me, they know I'm a Christian theologian, so I'm not gonna have self-conscious language in here about what Christianity means to me or what I don't think it is, or I'm not gonna go into a thing of that dispelling what you might have in your heads about this. I just thought, I'm not gonna be self-conscious about it in that way. And then I realized in about late 1990s, I just had too many crowds where, no, that's the issue, and I've got to speak to it. I'm more and more getting crowds that just have no kind of religious literacy at all to be able to appeal to evoke or anything, work with, and indeed getting crowds where indeed it's the majority are coming with just, if they think anything at all that's Christian, it's some kind of white nationalist way of thinking about Christianity that is mobilizing these questions I'm hearing and just how people are hearing it. And so, yeah, this was a transition for me, just to even get to a point where at least halfway through a talk, I would have some awkward, very self-conscious moment where I'd have to say, well, here is what it means to me. I understand it can be heard differently and it's been lived so differently in so much of the church's history. But here is why I hang with this gospel story, because it is formative for me, but it might not be coming off in the way that what you think of it as being.
I mean, obviously, taking the time to write a memoir, a lot of these questions and such come up.
Yeah.
And thinking about your own experiences while trying to externalize it can give clarity. So, this would be a fun way we can wrap up, and I'll look forward to getting to read it so we can talk more about it. But when you went through the process of writing a memoir, If you were going to make a like foreheads, I don't want to name any national monument that might involve sticking foreheads on a mountainside because we don't want to make it too nationalist here. But but if you're thinking of like four figures or four texts that have been on your bookshelf from the first time you read them, or four thinkers, like who would you say in going when you got done writing the first draft of the memoir? Whose words or text did you realize have been sitting with you for so long and played a role throughout the story?
Yeah. It's definitely Martin Luther King, number one, in terms of chronology and just
Mm-hmm.
all of it, really. That's why a few years ago I wrote a book called Breaking White Supremacy, and it just poured out of me because I'd spent my whole life really preparing to write it. And really, I think the chronology is not far off about what happened. I mean, even to me, getting past high school where it's just King, and but I'm already on the path from that, knowing that I needed and wanted to write, to read theologians and philosophers, and most of them just on my own, because I didn't even take a course in theology until I was a junior in college, and by then my head's filled up. I mean, I'm fully there by the time I even finally took a course that was theological in college. And so, who were they? Yeah, it's King to start with, and then Rauschenbusch next. And I have, Jim Cohn as well is sort of next in sequence, and in some ways next even just in my head and heart. And of course, he became a dear friend to me years later. And then this whole Kant Hegel, which I got started on very early. I got my first dose of Immanuel Kant first freshman year, and was doing the Kant Hegel. That really is it. Now, there's something important to be marked here. As long as you got me talking here a little bit about sort of how the memoir unfolds. I went to college in the early 1970s. So I got to Harvard Divinity School in the fall of 1974. And I certainly think of myself as a feminist when I got there. But feminist theology doesn't exist yet, or at least it's just coming into being. So start chapter 3, which is I arrive at Harvard Divinity School, now to start divinity school. And yeah, there's first a little bit of stuff about just even life in Cambridge, but then just goes hard and fast toward feminist theology just coming from nowhere. Because mine is the generation where, yes, Mary Daly just came out with Beyond God the Father a few months ago, and Rosemary Ruther is teaching at Howard University. So she's the next great feminist theologian, and she actually taught it for a year at Harvard back in 71, 72. But she got blasted while she was there because that's all Mary Daly people. And so she's becoming this important feminist theologian, and yet has never even taught it anywhere except for 1 year at Howard. So there's always that, for even in the kind of chronological telling, I knew what the next really huge thing needed to be for me when I got to Harvard Divinity School in the late in 74. And that's this what was so obvious to me. The next revolution in theology was everything that came with feminist theology, because it's previously feminism is just something that's political, right? It's about equal rights and equal rights amendment and things like that. But the idea that privileging gender as a category of analysis, and now reinterpreting all the doctrines in the light of a feminist hermeneutic, that only starts during that period, and it was enormously important to me onward. But there's a kind of a sequential thing that I continue to kind of acquire influences, including one we didn't come anywhere near here today, but I ended up at Princeton Seminary for a couple of years, got a couple of degrees there, and I ended up, the person I thought I was going to study with there, I did a little bit with. But I heard, there's some great teacher here that need to check out anyway. And I saw it right away. His name was James Loder. Never heard of him before. Just a fabulous teacher. And yeah, I ended up taking his courses, and Loder was a very important sort of influence for me. And I almost, he tried to get me to spend the rest of my life doing what he does, but I didn't. I didn't quite do that. But there's a sizable chunk of what becomes chapter 3 of just
Hmm.
all that, what that was.
Oh man, I'm excited about this. In the process of thinking through this, was there like the most memorable moment when you're in a seminar as a student and then like you realize no wonder I like teaching this text so much as a professor? Like were there those moments that like classroom experiences on either side with a particular text that rose to the memory?
Well, just stick with what we are just saying there. One day he walked into one of his classes. I'm sitting there with 50 people. By then, I'd asked a few questions in class. He kind of picked me out as for this role, and I'm an unknown at the seminary. I'm someone who just showed up, but started showing up in his classes. And he walked in with this it was over 1,000 pages, and it was called Transformations of the Human Spirit, because Loder was a religion and psychology guy. Freud and Jung and all of that stuff I wasn't really interested in, but I was now because he's so far into it. And he walks in with his thing like this, and he plops it on my desk, and he says, "Here, maybe you can find the book in here." And that's where I ended up with this relationship with him, where indeed I ended up, I read this whole, it's this sprawling mass of stuff, too many frameworks, heedless, brilliance leaping off of every page, but too many frameworks and interdisciplinary in a way that just doesn't exist out there. Which was also disabling for him. He had a hard time. He was a fabulous teacher, but had a hard time putting it together in the context of a book. So I ended up telling him, yeah, there are 2 books and there may be 3, depending on how you sort of line this out. That was a tremendously sort of formative thing for me, even think of myself as maybe I might someday be someone who writes books. I never thought of myself that way. I didn't have that kind of idea. Oh, I'll be someone who writes books, because I never expected. I wasn't going to be an academic anyway. I'm an organizer. That's what I do. That experience of helping him find what became the transforming moment, and also just realizing how there's a field that I had no particular interest in, religion and psych, and yet, wow, that's a whole other different angle about things that actually are quite familiar to me. I mean, you don't have to get too far into Freud and Jung to realize, oh my God, no, this is actually, these are similar issues, just in a different interdisciplinary matrix, and all kind of flooding back with religious meaning in a way that he made wonderfully meaningful. He was a great teacher, and not only was he a great teacher, but he had a teaching fellow named Laura Inglis, who was the purest Kierkegaardian I ever met in my life, and a brilliant person whom we lost much too soon. And so then, years later, I'm standing in front of college classrooms trying to explain Kierkegaard to college students, and trying to channel Kierkegaard for them so they can get it. And I would think about Laura, and I would just flush with shame at just how pitiful this is compared to what she would have been doing, with this class. So, along the way, you meet people like that along the way in theological education, and some of them are just in you for the rest of your life.
Oh man, no, that's wonderful. What a compliment with a burden to be handed 1,000 pages and asked what to do with it.
Yeah, yeah, and so.
Have you ever done that to a student?
Oh my God, no, I am shy. I mean, the idea that I could, no, oh my goodness. My teaching fellows, no, I'm here to serve you. What can I do for you? That's my approach.
Yeah. Well, this has been a real blast, Gary. The amount of time I've spent with you in my head, or in same places, but not got to like talk, just meant there are about 10 different potential interviews I just kept going between.
Yeah.
While you had your own stories front of mind, which, as someone that has stalked you on the internet long enough, knows that you don't always share your own story. So it was quite an honor to get to hear the personal side of the walking encyclopedia of liberal theology.
All right. Thank you, Trip. It was great talking to you.